Leah Carter parked at the far end of the lot on purpose. From there, the Seal Trident ceremony looked almost small. Just rows of metal bleachers, a low stage, and a sea of white uniforms against the California sun. From there, she could almost pretend she was just another proud sister, home from some Navy job, here to clap and go back to her life. She locked her car, smoothed the front of her plain navy dress, and checked her watch out of habit. No ribbons, no shoulder boards, no uniform. She'd left her stars in a garment bag in the trunk. This is Ben's day, she reminded herself, not mine. On the far side of the bleachers, she spotted them. Her father, Frank, already holding court, arms folded, baseball cap shoved back, voice carrying over the hum of families finding their seats. Her mother beside him, smaller, hands folded in her lap. An empty space next to them where Leah could have stood, if she wanted to sit in the blast radius of his opinions. She chose the back row instead. By the time she climbed halfway up the bleachers, Frank's voice had already reached her. "Least my son made something of himself," he was saying, loud enough for 3 rows to hear. "Seal, real man's work, not like my daughter. She dropped out of the Navy years ago, couldn't handle it." A couple in front of him murmured something sympathetic. The woman glanced over her shoulder at Leah, a quick, pitying look at the failed daughter in a plain dress. Leah slipped past a cluster of toddlers and sat down at the top, spine straight, hands folded loosely in her lap. Years of bridge watches and change of command ceremonies had trained her face into a calm mask. Inside, something tight and old pressed against her ribs, but she kept her breathing even. Down on the parade ground, the class marched in, freshly minted SEALs in immaculate uniforms, movements sharp and precise. Leah's eyes found her brother almost instantly. Ben Carter, square-jawed, focused, trident not yet pinned, but already there in the set of his shoulders. He caught sight of her up in the last row. For a second, his strict, neutral expression broke. The corners of his mouth twitched. His eyes flicked toward the stage, then back to her. A question there. "You good?" Leah gave the smallest nod. A few rows below, a young lieutenant in khakis looked up, did a double take, and tapped his buddy. "Hey, isn't that—" "Shut up, eyes front," the buddy hissed, but his gaze sneaked back toward the woman in the plain dress. Leah pretended not to notice. She'd given the same kinds of briefings these officers sat through in windowless rooms back in Norfolk and D.C. It didn't surprise her that 1 or 2 recognized her without the hardware on. She just hoped they'd keep their mouths shut, for Ben's sake, if not for hers. The ceremony began. Names were called, tridents pinned, families shouted and cried and waved signs. Frank applauded Ben with a yell that turned heads 3 sections over. Every few minutes, Leah caught phrases drift up the stands. "My boy, real operator. She could never handle this. Some people just aren't cut out for the life." Each line slid off Leah like water off hull plating. It wasn't new. It was just the same old script, spoken a little louder in a public place. What was new sat on the stage under a small canopy, the presiding flag officer. Vice Admiral Hughes, silver hair, posture like a steel girder, and eyes that missed nothing. Leah knew him well. He'd been her boss, her mentor, once the only person outside her crews who'd read her fitness reports all the way through. When she'd pinned on her star, he was the one who'd shaken her hand and said, "You earned every inch of this." Now, as he stepped up to the podium to give closing remarks, his gaze swept the crowd. He scanned the front rows, the fresh SEALs, their families, the brass. Then his eyes climbed all the way up to the last row. He saw her. Recognition flickered over his face. Brief, controlled. Then something that looked suspiciously like satisfaction. Leah's stomach dipped. "Don't," she thought silently, absurdly hoping that maybe, just this once, an admiral would ignore something he absolutely would not ignore. Hughes adjusted the mic. "Before we dismiss you today," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the parade ground, "I'd like to recognize someone in the audience who embodies the quiet, persistent kind of service that gets very little applause but holds this Navy together." Leah's fingers tightened on her knees. In the front row, Frank leaned forward, curious. "Rear Admiral Leah Carter," Hughes said, eyes on the back row. "Would you join me on stage?" For a heartbeat, the world seemed to go silent. Then, as Leah stood, every SEAL and sailor in uniform on the field snapped to attention, muscle memory kicking in. A flag officer had just been called out. In the third row, some relative whispered, "She's... what?" Another voice cut in, stunned. "Rear Admiral?" Leah stepped down from the bleachers, each metal plank ringing under her heels. She passed within a few feet of her parents. Frank's eyes were huge, uncomprehending. His mouth opened. No sound came out. Her mother's hand flew to her throat. "Leah?" Leah kept walking. As she reached the edge of the stage, as a young ensign moved automatically to offer her a hand up, then realized she wasn't just another guest and snapped a hurried salute instead. She returned it with crisp precision and climbed the steps to stand beside Admiral Hughes. 200 SEALs stood rigid on the field, watching the woman their class had just stood for. And in the bleachers, for the first time in Leah Carter's life, her father had absolutely nothing to say. Leah Carter had spent most of her life being the background to someone else's story. In their small coastal town, everybody knew Frank Carter. Foreman at the shipyard, pickup truck, loud laugh, louder opinions. The kind of man who could turn a hardware store errand into a 40-minute conversation and 3 favors owed. When Ben was born, Frank finally had what he'd always wanted: a son to carry the name. From that moment, the family orbit tilted. Leah, 4 years older, became useful. She could rock the baby, fetch bottles, do dishes, help with homework. She was praised for being such a good helper. Not for her grades, her quiet leadership, or the way she could calm Ben down when Frank's sharp words left him rattled. "Boys need pushing," Frank would say, cuffing Ben lightly on the back of the head when he missed a ball or botched a math problem. "Girls just need to be kept safe." Safe, in his vocabulary, meant small, close, predictable. When Leah joined JROTC in high school, Frank laughed. "Playing soldier?" he said at the dinner table, shoveling mashed potatoes onto Ben's plate. "That'll last 5 minutes, kiddo. You're not built for that life." Her mother, Elaine, had glanced at her with something softer in her eyes, but said nothing. Keeping the peace had been her survival skill for years. Leah didn't argue. She washed the dishes, finished her homework, and then spent hours in her room reading about ships, deployments, and oceans she'd never seen. By the time she earned an NROTC scholarship, the decision felt inevitable. The sea wasn't a rebellion. It was gravity. Frank took the news badly. "You're gonna throw your life away on some boat?" he'd scoffed, tossing his fork onto the table. "You'll be back in 6 months. Mark my words." He skipped her commissioning ceremony. He didn't come when she took her first division. Didn't come when she earned her SWO pin. When she called between underways and deployments, he changed the subject. "You still doing that Navy thing?" he'd ask, already pivoting to Ben's baseball stats or his own work stories. Leah adjusted. It was what she did. She poured her energy into the places that responded. Crews who needed a steady officer, chiefs who appreciated her listening more than she talked, COs who noticed she always had the numbers straight. Over the years, she went from Ensign Carter, struggling through her first bridge watch, to Commander Carter standing on the bridge wing of her own ship, feeling the deck hum under her boots. Her father never saw any of it. He saw Ben's football games, Ben's first apartment, Ben's tentative steps toward buds. When Ben called to say he'd made it through Hell Week, Frank's joy shook the walls. "That's my boy," he'd roared into the phone. "Real Navy. Real man's work." By then, Leah was halfway through her second command tour. The blow-up that broke whatever thin thread remained between them came over something absurd. Thanksgiving. She was deployed. He wanted her home. She couldn't come. "You always choose that damn Navy over family," he'd shouted over the phone, loud enough that Leah had held the receiver away from her ear. "If you cared about us, you'd find a way. You dropped out of this family a long time ago." "Dad, I'm in the middle of—" "Save it," he'd snapped. "You want to be married to the Navy? Fine. Don't expect a place at this table anymore." After that, holidays fell quiet. Calls went unanswered. When he did talk about her, it was in the past tense. "She dropped out," he'd tell neighbors, coworkers, anyone who asked about his daughter. Didn't last. Not everyone can hack it. It was easier, he'd found, to shrink her down to a failed attempt than to admit he didn't actually know what she did. Leah stopped trying to correct him. She poured herself into the job instead. The Navy noticed what he didn't. Tough billets led to tougher ones. Hard deployments led to medals she kept in drawers and evals that used words like indispensable and flag potential. When the call finally came, selection for Rear Admiral, lower half, she'd been in a windowless office at the Pentagon, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Her mother flew to D.C. for the pinning. Frank refused. "I'm not sitting through some ceremony for paperwork," he'd grumbled. "Call me when you're done playing pretend." So she didn't call, not that day. Instead, she stood in a small auditorium in her dress whites, while an admiral she respected placed a star on each shoulder and said, "Congratulations, Admiral Carter." Her mother cried softly in the second row. A few close shipmates clapped and cheered and made stupid jokes at the reception afterward. Leah went back to work. She assumed her father would hear eventually. He did, through someone else. And rather than ask her about it, he did what he always did when faced with something that threatened his version of reality. He doubled down on the story he preferred. "She dropped out," he said louder. "That Navy stuff didn't work out. My son, though, he's the one to watch. He's going to be a SEAL." By the time Ben's trident ceremony rolled around, the narrative was solid in his mind. Leah, the daughter who couldn't hack it, coming home from some vague civilian job. Ben, the rightful heir in uniform. Leah knew all of that as she took her seat in the back row that morning. She knew, too, something her father did not, that the man presiding over the ceremony had been in the room when she took her flag oath, that juniors in the crowd had sat through her briefings, that her record existed in databases and memories her father had never bothered to access. So when Admiral Hugh's eyes found hers over the sea of white uniforms, Leah felt a strange calm settle over her. She didn't know exactly what he would do, but for the first time in her life, she was sure of one thing. Whatever story her father had been telling about her was about to hit a wall called the truth. Leah reached the top of the dais, pulse steady in that strange way it always was before hard things. Flight ops, bad weather entries, casualty calls. Her body had learned long ago that fear and focus could coexist. Admiral Hughes leaned in just enough for only her to hear. "Didn't think I'd let you hide back there, did I, Admiral?" he murmured, eyes still on the crowd. Leah's lips twitched. "Sir, this is Ben's day." "It is," he agreed. "And he deserves to see exactly whose shoulders he's standing on." He turned back to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hughes said, his voice easily filling the stands, "you've just met today's class of newly minted SEALs. What most of you don't know is that many of the officers on this stage were once junior to the officer I'm about to introduce." A ripple passed through the formation. Several of the younger SEALs' eyes flicked up toward Leah. "In the audience today," Hughes continued, "we have Rear Admiral Leah Carter, United States Navy, surface warfare officer, multiple deployments, former commanding officer at sea, mentor to more than a few of the careers you see in front of you." He paused, letting the words sink in. "For 2 decades, she has led sailors where most people only ever see blue on a map. Admiral Carter, would you honor us by saying a few words to today's class?" He offered her the microphone. Somewhere behind him, an enlisted SEAL barked, "Eyes front!" More for himself than anyone else, fighting the urge to stare. Leah took the mic. Up close, she could see Ben in the front row, trident newly pinned on his chest, jaw clenched as if he might burst with pride, or laughter, or both. Past him, in the bleachers, she found her father. Frank was sitting very still. His mouth hung open half an inch, like a man who'd taken a punch he never saw coming. His hand still wrapped around a styrofoam cup, trembled just enough for coffee to shimmer near the rim. Leah inhaled. "Good morning," she began, voice calm and even. Years of shipboard announcements had sanded the nerves off public speaking. "Class 3XX, today is your day. You have done something few people even attempt and fewer still finish. You've earned the right to wear that gold on your chest. No one can take that from you." A few heads lifted higher. "I grew up in a small coastal town like a lot of you," she went on. "My family taught me there was such a thing as real work and background work. The stuff people clap for, and the stuff they don't notice unless it's missing." She let her gaze move over the families, feeling her father's stare like heat on her cheek. I joined the Navy anyway. Some people told me I'd never last. Some called what I did paperwork or said I dropped out. And a murmur went through a corner of the bleachers that had definitely heard Frank's earlier commentary. Leah continued, unflinching. Here's what I learned. The ocean doesn't care what people say about you. The mission doesn't care. Your shipmates don't care. They care if you show up. If you do your job when it's ugly and no one's clapping. If you don't leave them when it gets hard. She shifted the microphone to her other hand. Some of you have families who understand what you've done, she said. Some of you have families who don't. Not yet. Ben's eyes dipped almost imperceptibly toward the bleachers, then back up. That's all right, Leah said. You are not here to prove anyone wrong. You are here to prove your country right in trusting you with this job. She let that sit for a beat. And one day, she added, voice soft but clear, truth catches up. It always does. The record you build will walk into rooms long before you do. So build one you can live with, even if nobody back home ever fully understands it. On the edge of the bleachers, a young spouse wiped at her cheek. Leah gave the mic back to Hughes. Congratulations, gentlemen, she finished. Take care of each other. Come home right. And remember, strength isn't about who shouts the loudest, it's about who still shows up when no one's watching. Thank you, Admiral, Hughes said. And the applause that followed was genuine, rising up from the SEALs, the officers, and a good slice of the families. Leah stepped back, giving the stage back to the class. As she moved to the side, a lieutenant commander on the platform leaned over and whispered, Ma'am, with respect, but we thought you looked familiar. She smiled. We all look the same in coveralls, Commander. Down below, her father still hadn't moved. After the formalities ended, chaos bloomed across the parade ground in that familiar way. Families surging toward the new SEALs, command photos being staged, toddlers getting lost between boots and folding chairs. Leah tried to slip back toward the rear, but it was too late. Ma'am, Admiral Carter? A young SEAL with a freshly pinned trident and a grin too wide for his face jogged up, practically skidding to a stop. Ma'am, I served on Higgins when you had her. You don't know me, but thank you for the way you ran that ship. Leah shook his hand. Glad you made it through, petty officer. Another officer appeared, this one a lieutenant in khakis. Ma'am, Sarah Lee, you once tore apart one of my readiness briefs at Surflant. Leah winced. Sorry about that. It made me better, Lee said simply. And it helped me get here. And they spoke for a few minutes. Short, professional, full of specific references to inspections, deployment schedules, and hard calls Leah had almost forgotten. Each person peeled away with a thank you, a salute, or a photo request. All of it happened within easy earshot of Frank Carter. Ben finally broke free from his own mob and beelined over, still smelling like brine and gun oil, eyes bright. Admiral, he exaggerated the word, but the pride underneath it was real. Ma'am. Congratulations, Chief, Leah said, deliberately bumping his shoulder with hers. You did it. He glanced over her shoulder toward the bleachers. You know he's processing, Ben murmured. I know, Leah said. That's his job now. Ben gave a quick, crooked smile. For the record, I always knew you didn't drop out. I know that too. She squeezed his arm. Go be with your teammates. He hugged her quickly, harder than she expected, then vanished back into the knot of blue and gold. After a few more handshakes and quiet congratulations, the crowd thinned. The command staff drifted back toward vehicles, families headed for cars or the base club. Leah was halfway to the parking lot when she heard it. Leah. Her father's voice, smaller than she remembered. She turned. Frank stood a few yards away, hands shoved into the pockets of his jacket, shoulders not quite as broad as they'd been in her childhood. Up close, she noticed the deepening creases at the corners of his mouth, the way sun and time had browned and roughened his skin. For once, he didn't look like the loudest man in the room. He looked like an older man who didn't quite know where to put himself. You, he cleared his throat. You're an admiral. Yes, Leah said, I am. You never told me. She tilted her head. I called when I commissioned, she said evenly. I called when I took my first ship. I called when I made O5, when I made captain. You changed the subject, or you didn't answer, or you told people I'd dropped out. Frank's jaw worked. I didn't. It was just. He gestured vaguely back toward the empty bleachers. People ask. I didn't know what to say. You were always gone. He was here. He jabbed a thumb in the vague direction of where Ben had been standing. Leah said nothing. Her silence seemed to pull the air out of him. I thought. He swallowed. I thought you were doing some office thing, not that. He nodded toward the stage where Admiral Hughes had stood. Not this. You didn't want to hear about it, Leah replied. So I stopped trying to make you. He opened his mouth, closed it again. For the first time in her memory, Frank Carter looked embarrassed. Why did you sit in the back? He asked, as if grasping for anything he could understand. You could have been up there with them, with the bigwigs. Because it was Ben's day, Leah said simply. Not mine. He stared at her for a long moment. Around them, the parade ground had mostly emptied. A stray program skittered across the concrete, pushed by the salty breeze. In the distance, a bugle sounded something faint and familiar. Finally, Frank exhaled. I've been telling people you quit, he admitted, voice rough. For years. Told them my son was the one who stuck it out. That you didn't have what it takes. He winced at his own words. That must have felt good, Leah said, not unkindly. For you. He flinched. I didn't know, he said again, as if repetition could erase everything. You didn't ask, she corrected gently. There's a difference. He looked down at his boots, then up at the empty stage, then back at her. I don't know what to say. Leah felt a faint, unexpected flicker of mercy. For all his bluster, he truly looked like a man whose entire script had just been torn in half in front of a live audience. You don't have to say anything right now, she said. You can sit with it. Think about it. Maybe next time someone asks about your daughter, you can start with the truth instead of the story that makes you most comfortable. He nodded once, slowly. Are you going to leave again? He asked. It wasn't accusation this time. It was half plea, half fear. I have a ship to get back to, Leah said. That's my job. But I'll be around for the family gathering tonight. For Mom, for Ben. She let that hang there, for Mom. For Ben. Not for him. Not yet. If you ever want to know who I actually am, she added, you can call. And you can listen. With that, she gave him a small, formal nod, a courtesy she might offer any civilian, and turned toward the parking lot. Behind her, for once, Frank Carter didn't shout after her, didn't mutter, didn't perform. He just stood alone on the concrete, watching the daughter he'd told the world, dropped out of the Navy, walk away as a rear admiral whose respect he'd never thought to earn. The ceremony dissolved into small clusters of uniforms and families, blue and white moving like tides across the concrete. Leah stepped off the stage, heart finally slowing, and felt the air change around her. Where people had brushed past her before without a second glance, they now shifted instinctively, leaving a clear path. Ma'am, Admiral, excuse me, ma'am. A young lieutenant she recognized from a PACFLT exercise almost tripped over his own boots getting to her. Ma'am, he flushed. I sat in on your readiness brief last year, the one about logistics bottlenecks. You saved our necks when that shipment went sideways. Leah gave him a small smile. Glad it helped, Lieutenant. That was a team effort. He nodded awkwardly and backed away, but another officer slid into the space he'd left. Rear Admiral Carter? A commander, seal insignia on his chest, stuck out his hand. You probably don't remember, ma'am, but you signed off on our additional air support when everyone else told us to make do. That decision changed that deployment. My guys still talk about it. His grip was firm, his eyes were steady, and he spoke loud enough that the words carried to the first rows of families. Thank you, Leah said. You took care of your people. I just made sure you had the tools. Ma'am, he said again, with a little nod that looked a lot like respect, then stepped aside for the next one. They came in waves. a lieutenant who'd once been a terrified ensign on her bridge, a logistics officer who'd implemented her boring supply recommendations and watched casualty rates drop, a senior chief who just squeezed her shoulder and said, "Good to see you up here where you belong, ma'am." All of it happened within sight and earshot of Frank Carter. Ben finally broke free from his new teammates and crossed the crowd in long strides, the fresh trident gleaming on his chest. For a moment, standing in front of her in his tan uniform, he looked 12 again, the kid she'd taught to ride a bike and snuck extra dessert to when their dad was in a mood. "Rear Admiral Carter," he said formally, snapping a crisp salute. She huffed out a laugh despite herself and returned it. "Knock it off, Ben." He dropped the salute and pulled her into a hug, crushing her against his chest. "I'm so damn proud of you," he murmured into her hair. "You're the one who just survived buds," she said, pulling back to look at the small bruise at his hairline, the exhaustion in his eyes. "I'm proud of you." He glanced over her shoulder toward the front row where their father sat frozen, hands braced on his knees as if the earth had tilted under him. "He had no idea," Ben said quietly. Leah followed his gaze. Frank's face was pale, his jaw working, eyes fixed on her like he was trying to reconcile two different people in one body. "He didn't want to have an idea," she answered. "There's a difference." A shadow crossed Ben's face, regret maybe, or recognition. "I'm sorry I didn't say more. About you, I didn't want to make it worse." Duh. "It wasn't your job to fix him," Leah said. "Go take your pictures, this is your day." He nodded once, squeezed her hand, and jogged off toward his teammates and the official photographer. When the crowd thinned and most families drifted toward the parking lot, Frank finally stood. Elaine trailed behind him, fingers twisted in the strap of her purse, eyes flicking from his face to Leah's and back like she was bracing for impact. Frank stopped a few feet away. Up close, he looked older than she remembered, more gray at his temples, deeper lines around his mouth. The confident swagger she grew up with had been replaced by something brittle and fragile. "Why didn't you tell me that I saw?" he blurted. "Not congratulations, not I'm proud of you, just that." Leah let the question sit between them for a moment. The wind tugged at the corners of her dress. On the parade ground behind her, sailors were folding chairs, their motions methodical and indifferent to the family drama playing out nearby. "I did," she said quietly. "For years. You just didn't listen." He flinched as if she'd struck him harder than he'd ever hit her. "That's not, I mean," he dragged a hand down his face. "I thought you were doing desk work, paper, busy work, not this." "You never asked," Leah said. "Not really. You asked in ways that told me what answer you wanted. You're not still playing Navy, are you? You're not still out there on boats." "That's not asking. That's telling." Elaine took a tiny step forward. "Leah, your father—" "Mom," Leah said gently, it's okay. He can speak for himself." Elaine fell silent, eyes shining. Frank swallowed. His voice dropped, rougher. "All these years, people asked about my kids. I bragged about Ben, told them you washed out, told them you found some little job somewhere. I didn't what?" Leah asked, not unkindly. "Didn't think," he admitted, staring at the ground. "Didn't want to think about you doing something bigger than me, or dangerous, or important." The words seemed to cost him. "Because that meant I didn't know how to talk about it, or help, or protect you." "You didn't have to protect me," Leah said. "You just had to see me. I would have settled for you not lying about me to other people." His head jerked up. Guilt flashed in his eyes, followed by something raw. "I'm sorry," he said, the words ragged. "For that. For all of it." Leah studied him. The man who'd told her she'd never last. The man who had just watched an admiral and 200 SEALs stand for his failed daughter. "For a long time," she said slowly, "I thought if I just did enough, achieved enough, got one more promotion, you'd see me. That's not why I stayed in the Navy, but it was a side quest." He let out a weak, humorless huff. "Side quest, huh?" "Yeah." She held his gaze. "But today wasn't about proving you wrong. I came here to watch my little brother get his trident. The rest of it, That's between you and reality, Dad. Not you and me. He opened his mouth, closed it, looked down at his hands, rough and nicked from a lifetime of manual work, and then back up at the daughter he'd finally seen for the first time. I don't know how to fix this, he said. I don't even know where to start. Leah glanced past him to where Elaine watched, holding her breath, to where Ben posed with his team, grinning, to the stage where Admiral Hughes spoke quietly with a staff officer, occasionally glancing their way but not intervening. You start, she said, by not calling me a dropout anymore, by not cutting me down to make yourself feel taller, by asking and listening, like you just did. He nodded once. It was small and stiff, but it was real. Can we talk? He asked. Not now. I know this is Ben's thing, but sometime. Leah didn't rush to fill the silence. She let herself feel the weight of the years behind them and the rank on her shoulders, even if it was invisible today. Maybe, she said at last, if you can meet me as I am, not as the story you've been telling. He swallowed again and gave a short, honest answer. I'll try, he said. She didn't hug him. He didn't reach for her, but when he stepped back, he looked smaller and for the first time real. Elaine stepped forward then, her voice barely above a whisper. I've always been proud of you, she said. I kept hoping he'd see it on his own. Leah's throat tightened. Thanks, Mom. And they stood there in an awkward triangle as the crowd thinned and the California sun slid a little lower in the sky. 3 people in the first shaky minutes of a new kind of conversation. Behind them, on the parade ground where the truth had finally said her name out loud, the last of the folding chairs clicked shut. The days after the ceremony thinned out into travel orders, inbox pings, and the familiar rhythm of a flag officer's life. Leah flew back to D.C., changed out of the plain dress, and slid into the uniform that matched what everyone at work already knew. Stars on her shoulders, weight of entire task forces in the binders on her desk. If anyone in the Pentagon had heard that her father used to introduce her as the kid who dropped out, they didn't say it. They just handed her briefs, asked for decisions, and followed her lead. She didn't call home. She sent Ben one text that night. Proud of you. Take care of your team. Hydrate and don't do anything stupid just to prove you're a SEAL. He answered with a grainy photo from the team house and a string of laughing emojis. Her father's number stayed at the bottom of her contacts list. Unblocked, untouched. Weeks slid into months. Leah flew out to ships, sat in steel war rooms with captains and chiefs, rerouted supply lines, signed evaluations. A junior officer in Bahrain saluted, then blurted, Ma'am, I saw the video from the Trident ceremony. That was something. Leah only smiled and said, Focus on your quals, Lieutenant. But later, alone in her quarters, she let herself replay the moment Hughes had said her name. Back in the coastal town, life kept moving. Elaine sent occasional emails, photos of the dog, a picture of Ben and his fiancée at a pier bar, a line here and there about Frank being quieter these days. Then, one late night after a 12-hour planning conference, Leah found an actual letter in the stack of interoffice mail. No return address printed, just familiar handwriting. She carried it back to her office, closed the door, and sat for a full minute staring at her name. When she opened it, the first page was a mess of crossed-out starts. The sentences that survived were jagged and simple. Leah, I don't know how to write to an admiral. I barely know how to write to my daughter. You were right. I didn't ask. I told. And I lied about you because it was easier than admitting you'd done something I couldn't. I always pictured the Navy as something that would chew you up. It didn't occur to me you'd outgrow my picture of it and of you. I'm sorry. Not just for what I said at home. For the way I talked about you to everyone else. I would like to know you for real now, if you'll let me. Dad. She read it twice, a third time. There were no excuses buried between the lines. Just a man who had finally run out of ways to make himself feel taller by shrinking his own child. She didn't answer that night, or the next. Instead, she forwarded a different email. To Ben. How's the pipeline treating you? Also, Dad wrote, not sure what to do with that. Ben replied almost immediately. Pipeline is a meat grinder, but good. About Dad, he's different since that day. Not perfect, just less loud, more listening. You don't owe him anything, but if you want to meet, I'll sit there with you. Or not, your call. Leah stared at the blinking cursor in a new message to Frank for a long time before typing 5 words. Got your letter, I heard you. She hovered, then added, not ready for big talks. Maybe a short call sometime. Leah. She hit send before she could overthink it. 2 days later, her phone rang from an unknown local number. She answered on instinct. Rear Admiral Carter, she said automatically. There was a tiny pause. Hi, Frank said. His voice sounded smaller over cell reception. It's Dad. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel the old defensive brace ripple up her spine. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the wall. Hi, she said. I've got 10 minutes before another meeting. That okay? 10 minutes is more than I deserve, he answered, trying for a joke and almost choking on it. They didn't talk about the past, not really. They talked about the dog and the weather and the ship she was headed to next, and Ben complaining about cold swims. But under it all, there was an unfamiliar tone. Careful, honest, like both of them were testing the floor to see what would hold. When the call timer hit 9 minutes, Leah said, I have to go, Dad. He inhaled sharply. Okay, thanks for picking up. Thanks for calling, she replied. Afterward, she sat at her desk, fingers resting lightly on the edge of her keyboard, and realized she felt lighter, not fixed, not erased, just slightly less alone in the story that had always felt one-sided. 6 months later, the ocean was a bruise-colored sheet under a streaked orange sky as Leah stepped out onto the flag bridge catwalk of her flagship. Below, the ship hummed with evening routine, mess decks closing, watch sections changing, a bosun's pipe wailing somewhere forward. The scent of steel and salt and jet fuel wrapped around her, familiar as breath. She rested her hands on the cold rail and looked out, letting the wind take the last of the day's briefs out of her shoulders. In the breast pocket of her jacket, her phone buzzed twice. One message from Ben, a blurry selfie with a half-frozen team, grins wide, tridents catching sunlight. Still alive, don't tell Dad some of the stuff we do. Love you, Admiral Sis. The second message was a photo from Elaine, a scrapbook page with Leah's promotion article on one side and a printout of a SEAL Trident ceremony memo on the other. In the corner, Frank's handwriting, my kids. Both of them. Leah smiled, small and real. She'd seen them twice since the ceremony. Once for a short, awkward dinner where Frank mostly listened and Elaine mostly beamed. Once at a community event where he had introduced her, stumbling but clear, as my daughter, Admiral Carter, like the words were a weight he was finally willing to carry honestly. She hadn't forgiven everything. Some things weren't hers to forgive. They were habits he'd have to unlearn, conversations he'd have to keep starting. But the script had changed. She no longer walked into that house as the extra. She walked in as herself. And they were slowly learning to meet her there. Down on the flight deck, a helo turned lazily, rotors thumping. Somewhere in the carrier strike group, a junior lieutenant was probably cursing her name in a logbook, the same way she'd once cursed some unnamed admiral's directives. It made her grin. Behind her, the flag lieutenant stepped out, then paused, sensing she wasn't ready to be interrupted. Ma'am, he said softly. Ops brief in 15 minutes. I'll be there, she answered without turning. She took one more breath of cold, clean air. For years, people had told a story about her. The daughter who dropped out, the girl who couldn't hack it, the sister who vanished into the Navy. That story had never been true. It had just been loud. But in the end, it wasn't her job to shout over it. Her job was this: steel under her boots, wind in her face, decisions that mattered, sailors who looked to her with steady trust, a brother somewhere in dark water wearing a trident she respected deeply, a father slowly, awkwardly learning that his daughter had built a life he hadn't imagined, and that his opinion had never been the engine of it. She slipped her phone back into her pocket, fingers brushing the thin edge of the SEAL ceremony photo tucked behind her orders. Let people say what they want, she murmured to the horizon. The record always catches up. Then Rear Admiral Leah Carter, U.S. Navy, turned away from the sunset, walked back into the flag bridge, and went to work.